Thank you, Ibn Haldun University, for organizing this wonderful event and for inviting me. I want to congratulate ICYF for putting together this program also at a time when we need serious thinking and we need certainly Muslim thinkers. And that's what I want to talk about today. But before I begin my remarks about what thinking is, what it involves, and how we relate it to Islamic identity, I want to again commend the Ibn Haldun University team here for putting together high-level programs. I was just briefed that they're planning to have mostly graduate studies here. So I was reminded of the prominent economist Eric Schumacher's famous saying, which is also the title of his book, "Small is beautiful." So keep this university small, but high quality. You don't have to go really big to be good or relevant. I think we have enough big stuff going on already, but that big translates mostly into quantity rather than quality. And let's remember what René Guénon called one of his books. He called the reign of quantity and the signs of the times. And the bigger the quantity goes, I guess the closer the signs become. So I will rather ask you to keep this school small but deep, important, relevant, and I think that's what you're doing. Now, let me turn to my topic here for today. I think the first question here that we all have to ask ourselves is, what is thinking? If you are to talk about Muslim future or future Muslim thinkers, we had a little discussion about whether this wording was right or not, but I guess that's for another discussion. I don't want to play around with words, but the key question is, what is thinking, before we ask ourselves how a Muslim thinker should be thinking. What is thinking? According to our common daily understanding of the term thinking, thinking is information gathering, but it is not. Thinking is certainly not data analysis. Thinking is not simply making connections between concepts or between objects and concepts. Thinking involves more than all this. There is an element of thinking in collecting information, but there we already are faced with a major confusion between information and knowledge. We think that we live in the age of information. We have gone through the information revolution, thinking that, well, this must somehow be related to knowledge, to wisdom, to thinking. No, it's not. Information is not knowledge. Information is just raw material of facts, numbers, data. They become knowledge only when they are organized with a goal towards certain targets, certain conclusions. But even then, knowledge as defined as such will not be sufficient to lead us to our goal. We have to go beyond that level of knowledge also. We have to seek, based on knowledge, what the Islamic tradition called wisdom, hikmah. What is wisdom? I'll come to that in just a few minutes. Thinking is certainly not a summary of the internal workings of my mind. Since Descartes, a good part of Western philosophy grounded itself in what came to be known as subjectivism, where the knowing subject defines what knowledge is, and the knowing subject, in fact, assigns meaning to the world. Whether we are aware of it or not, we mostly operate under this illusion, as Muslims as well. That is, we operate with the assumption that there is a world out there which is devoid of meaning, significance, and intelligence, and we as knowing subjects attach meaning or assign meaning to property or properties of meaning to things out there. So this approach turns all thinking, all science, all philosophy, into an exercise in my own internal workings of my mind. So what I see, what I define, what I describe as the world becomes the world. So what I define as reality becomes reality. This is the height of subjectivism. And we are yet to free ourselves from the remnants of the subjectivist thinking. Maybe if I have time, I will come to that in just a few minutes. So if thinking is more than just the internal workings of my mind, which, by the way, if this was the case, we will never get out of our minds. And you have the problem of solipsism. How do I know that what I have in mind as a concept, as an abstract notion, is related to the world outside? How do I know that what I call the pen is really a pen, but not a figment of my imagination or something that I create in my mind? I can never make that leap from my mind to the real world. Islamic intellectual tradition never faced this problem because it began with the assumption that the moment the world of existence is created, it's already saddled with meaning. It comes with its own load of meaning and significance before I attain to it, or before I, to use the term of phenomenology, intend to it. That is, before I begin to function intellectually in relation to the things outside. Meaning that not only the world exists independently of me, which is obviously the case, whether I exist or not, or whether I think about the world or not, the world out there exists, right? Independent of me. I do not create the world. Not only that, but also the world has meaning, again, independently of me as a knowing subject. That means that I come to know the reality of things. I come to discover the meaning of things. So I do not make up meaning for things. I come to discover them. So in this sense, all thinking is actually an exercise in ontology, in existence. Because the key question, I think the fundamental question for all sorts of thinking, whether philosophical, theological, scientific, artistic, doesn't matter, is the following question. Why is there existence rather than nothing? Have you ever thought about this? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist? Why does the world of existence exist? That is the key fundamental question to which all serious thinking have to answer, have to find answers, right? So this brings us to the fundamental question of existence. What is existence? What the Muslim philosophers called wujud. And what is the connection or the difference between existence and existent? Wujud and mawjud. Is existence a sum total of things that exist? That is wujud a sum total of mawjud? Or existence is more than just what exists out there? Muslim philosophers from Farabi to Ibn Sina all the way to Ibn al-Arabi and Mullah Sadra have given significant answers to this question. How much we know about them, that's a big question. So let me open a parenthesis here, refer to the title. I said I don't want to play around words, but I think it's important. The title of this forum is called Muslim Future Thinkers Forum, and we were just maybe joking a little bit during lunch that, well, that's good. It actually forces us to think about the future. That's wonderful. You know, we have to have an open mind and future-looking perspective to things. But, you know, only God knows the future, as Professor Mahmoud Erol Kılıç pointed out. And we said, yeah, that's true. So does that mean that we should stop thinking about the future? No. Knowing fully that only God knows the future, we have to still think about, you know, what the future should be like, will be like, what contributions can we make to make it a better future. But before asking that question, I think we have to ask ourselves whether we know anything about our own present. And more importantly, what do we know about our past? If we are to think about future, shape it in the way we want to shape it, what do we know about our own present state of affairs? What do you know, or how much do we know about our own past, our own tradition, our own history, our own collective memories? I don't mean this as a rhetorical question. It's a serious question. If you look at how much work we have done or we have failed to do in terms of bringing our own intellectual tradition to bear upon our own present thinking today, the picture is not a bright one. We are still yet to publish in critical editions all the major works of Islamic intellectual tradition. Still, works of Ibn Sina, Farabi, Kindi, and these are the most prominent, well-known names, by the way, are yet to be published in good, scholarly, reliable, critical editions, not to talk about even the translations into other languages. How about hundreds of other scholars who are just waiting out there to be studied, to be discovered? All the big names we know, of course, yes, we have some ideas about some of their works and ideas, but if you compare it to how, for example, Western scholarship has studied its own intellectual tradition, all the way from the Greeks to the Roman, Hellenistic period, medieval ages, modern period, etc., there is no comparison. Hundreds of thousands of studies have been done on Plato and Aristotle and St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Kant, Hegel, go down the list. Literally thousands of works. When it comes to our own scholarship, it's really peanuts. It's so insufficient. It's so insufficient. So we owe, in fact, to our own intellectual ancestors this work, right? To try to understand what they have built as culture, civilization, science, art, thinking. But they did this, again, not at the superficial level we think. The question is not to write X number of books, but really to produce serious thinking. Because without deep, profound, serious thinking, there is no culture, there is no civilization. If a civilization, as I try to define, is the implementation of a certain worldview and understanding of the world of existence in human lives, in terms of culture, society, politics, and you have this connection between this metaphysical level and the socio-political level, that means that you have to first have a proper understanding of those metaphysical principles that produce a culture, a human society, a city, an art, and aesthetics. So you have to begin with those metaphysical principles. But I know these things are not very popular in the age in which we live. Because today we are not thinking, but processing information. We think that we are thinking, but we are not. We are simply processing information. Through social media now, our attention span gets even shorter. By processing, that is consuming, the type of information put out there in the media, in the social media, we think we are thinking. No, we are not. We are simply processing information. We are not able to go beyond that superficial level of collecting information, analyzing data. We are not yet thinking. Serious thinking is seen as abstract, as irrelevant, as non-popular, as non-profitable. It doesn't produce immediate results. It doesn't give any headlines, right? So it's not very popular. So why should you study? I mean, if you can become a social media phenomenon by tweeting a couple of things. When you have this attraction, why go for serious thinking? That's the psychology, that's the climate in which we live. But that's precisely why we need serious thinking. To understand ourselves, to understand the world of existence in which we live, to understand the connections between the two, so that we can have a proper understanding of what our tradition is, what our present tells us, and what our future should be like. So I come back to this question that I just put to you a few minutes ago. All serious thinking begins with the following question: why is there something rather than nothing? Could things be any different than the way they are? Imagine a completely different world order where, for example, we as human beings do not have 2 legs, but maybe 3. But that's not the case, right? We have 2 legs, 2 hands. Why? Could that all change? Could that all have been very different? And who made it things the way they are? And what can I do now as a human subject, as a knowing subject, first to understand why things are the way they are, and if I can help to make them any better. Wittgenstein once said in his philosophical investigations, while he was talking about family resemblances, after he left behind all this logical atomism and positivism in his first period in philosophical, in Tractatus, where he said, I'm trying to understand the world that is as it is, not according to my mind. But things could have been very different, he said. But I don't know how. He said things could have been very different. He meant it in a very, very general sense. It probably meant that the rules of language could have been very different. The syntax of the human language could have been very different. Or maybe he meant, for example, he could have been a rich businessman rather than a poor philosopher. Maybe he meant it in all these different senses of the term. We don't know, but that's what he wrote in his diary or in his philosophical notebooks. Things could have been very different. When I read that, immediately I thought of the idea of contingency, mumkin al-wujud in Islamic philosophy. I said, this is what he is trying to get at. Remember what Ibn Sina said, which, by the way, he took from Al-Farabi, because much of what you see in Ibn Sina really comes from Al-Farabi, but Ibn Sina was a genius to bring them all together and, making them more precise and deeper. And he divided existence into 3, as you know. There are 3 types of existence. There is the wajib al-wujud, the necessary being, without which nothing can exist. And wajib al-wujud is the self-sufficient existence also. It is that which exists by itself. It is that which doesn't need another existence for its own, or another source for its own existence. And there can be only one such existence, only one such being, a self-sufficient being. And then there is the mumkin al-wujud, contingent being or possible being, meaning that it's hung somewhere between existence and non-existence. It exists but may not. It did exist but may not have had. So he introduced this really remarkable concept of the contingency of existence, mumkin al-wujud. When you think about this, we are all mumkin al-wujud, you and I, we in this room. We exist now, but we may not have existed. So what does that tell us about our own state of existence? Tomorrow we may not exist. This could be my last lecture. I don't know. So it gives me a lot to think about, right? We could have been very different. We could have been in different parts of the world. We could have been doing different things. So it's all within the mumkin al-wujud concept. Now, when you think about this, if you are to build a new future, right, different from our present state of, I can use a lot of words to describe our present situation, but I don't want to despair you. If you are to think of a better future, so you have to think about in terms of, okay, a future mumkin wujud, how can that be? How can I imagine that? But I have to do that, obviously, with my roots firmly established in my own tradition, in my own habitat. And then he introduced the third concept, mumtani al-wujud, impossible existence. Obviously, 2 plus 2 is 4, it cannot be 5, or a square circle cannot exist, this kind of thing. So he gave us examples from logic and mathematics that, these are the fundamental modes of existence, and there cannot be a fourth one. Well, think about it. Why not? Maybe you can come up with the fourth mode of existence. Maybe Ibn Sina was short of thinking about this. You can try. I mean, it's a good challenge. Try. I've been trying. I couldn't come up with another fourth, but you can try certainly. But the point is that all thinking comes down to an exercise in existence and its modalities. That is, when I say, for example, this is a pen, and I'm giving this lecture in a hall, I'm referring to existence, right? I'm referring to an object called pen. I'm referring to a place where we are, a hall, at Ibn Haldun University at a precise time in Istanbul, and so on and so forth. But what are these things? These are not just simply objects. These are different manifestations of existence, different modalities of existence. It's not that these things make up what we call existence. It's the other way around. Existence manifests itself, appears in different modes, in different colors. And this is what called by Muslim philosophers anha'ul wujud, modalities of existence. Mullah Sadra has written a lot about this, and he in fact changed the thinking about this whole issue, taking his cue again from Ibn Sina, but more importantly from Ibn al-Arabi, where he said existence, wujud, is not a totality, is not a sum of mawjudat. It's more than that. To give you another example why this is the case, when you hold a book, what is a book? Is a book a sum of its physical qualities, its cover, its number of pages, the ink that was used to produce it, what else? The binding, its color, ink, what else? Pictures in it. These are the physical properties of a book, but they are not the book itself. The book is more than a sum of all these physical properties, right? A book is something that you read. A book is something that you learn something from. So the wujud of book, to use this multi-language terminology, is more than the physical properties of that book. Because the same book could be printed in smaller font, so it comes in, say, 150 pages. In bigger font, it comes out as 250 pages. With pictures, without pictures, etc. Doesn't lose the quality of being a book, a source of knowledge, source of information, right? Changes shape, physical properties, but it doesn't lose its core identity of being a book. A chair that you are sitting on right now. You can imagine hundreds of thousands of different types of chairs, right? Different colors, different sizes, different legs, different levels of comfort, reclining, not reclining, but they're all chairs. What is a chair? It's the definition. Again, what Muslim philosophers call the mahiyya, the essence or the quiddity of chair is that on which you sit. That's the definition of a chair. Its surah, its shape, its form can change, can take on many different forms. So the point is that, now apply this to the rest of existence. You have this limitless variety of things that appear in different shapes and colors and forms. What unites all this is the reality of existence. So it's not that these things make up existence, what we call wujud, but rather wujud appears or reveals itself in different shapes and forms. And every serious thinking is an exercise in understanding these different modalities of existence. Now, when we accept this assumption, that means that we have to go beyond, first of all, the internal workings of my mind. I have to attend to existence itself. I cannot pretend to be a semi-godlike being that looks upon the world from high on. I cannot look at the world from what Thomas Nagel called the position of nowhere. That is the hubris of modernity. That is, I can look at the world from a position of nowhere as God sees the world. Because, I assign meaning to it. I am the one that gives meaning to the world, because the world doesn't have any meaning. It's that matter. That's what the logical positivists said in the 1930s and 40s, right? At the height of scientism, the world itself doesn't have any meaning. It's just matter. Matter is dark. Matter has no meaning. Therefore, I am the one that can assign meaning to things. So suddenly, modernity, through a couple of centuries of Enlightenment thinking, turned the human subject into a semi-God, that I am at the center of the universe. Paradoxically, modern science criticized medieval Christian theology for placing the world at the center of the universe, and now Enlightenment actually replaced the world with the knowing subject and placed the human person at the center of the universe. Because it's not only the world that doesn't have any meaning, it's the entire existence. It's the entire universe, galaxies. They don't have any meaning. I am the one to assign meaning to them. That's the hubris of modernity. We never had this problem again in the Islamic intellectual tradition because of the principle that I mentioned earlier, that according to Islamic thought, the moment the world of existence begins to exist or created, it comes saddled with meaning. And I think it's stated very clearly in the Quran, when the Quran teaches us actually how to pray. رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا. Oh God, you have not created all this in vain, for nothing. After, as you know the verse, describing the heaven and earth and how God has made all these things, to the service of human beings and so on and so forth, how he has created order in the universe, mizan, and so on and so forth. And then God asks us to say this prayer. God is not praying to himself, he's asking us to pray to him. When he says, oh God, you have not created all this in vain, for nothing, batil. You have created all this for a purpose. That means all these things have a purpose in themselves, whether I understand them or not. Okay, if that's the case, then thinking entails two important elements. On the one hand, I do establish connections between objects and concepts, ideas, also establish connections between ideas and ideas. Right, I bring concepts together. That's one track of thinking. But also, I discover, I unveil the meaning that is inherent in the nature of things. The first one is what we may call, in generic terms, is insha. That is, I do construct knowledge. And the second one is, again, we can call it in a generic term, kashf. Now, what is insha? I construct, right? I construct information, I construct knowledge. I put together, different modes of knowledge, and I produce something new. There's no problem with that, okay. That doesn't make me the sole owner or the interpreter of the world, but I do make my own contribution there. But then there is the element of kashf, unveiling, discovering, removing the veil, so that truth itself can show. So in the second exercise, or the second track of thinking, what I do is that I let things be themselves. I do not intervene, I do not encroach upon their state of existence, but I do let them be themselves, so that their reality shows themselves by themselves. In order to do that, I have to attend to the reality of existence. I have to take it seriously. I cannot act like I am the master of the world. I have to treat it as my trust, and I have to be a keeper of it. That's where the environmental crisis has originated in the modern period, because we stopped looking at the world of nature as a trust, as something that was given to us as a trust, but rather as something that we think we owe. And when we own it, we think we can do anything we can or we want with it. That is not the case, and we see the consequences today in the world. So when I say kashf, I do not simply mean it in the mystical sense of the term, even though it can mean that too. But kashf is like removing the veil. And this was narrated to me by my professor, Dr. Nasser, may God give him a long life and healthy life, when one day Henry Corbin was teaching in Iran. This was before the revolution in 1970s, I think. He was asked, probably by Allama Tabatabai, how he will translate the word phenomenology into Islamic languages. Because he was talking about phenomenology, he was teaching Husserl, Heidegger, etc. So he asked this very interesting question, because I want to understand this in my own language, phenomenology. How can you translate it into, say, Arabic, Persian, Turkish? You want to give it a try? Huh? Have you ever thought about this? Like, phenomenology, right? It's a branch of philosophy that claims or that aims to let things be themselves, speak for themselves. You remove the barriers, the obstacles, between the knowing subject and the object itself, so that, the sun shines by itself, the rose smells by itself. You don't have to do anything. You just let them be. All right? Phenomenology. Corbin gave this very interesting answer. He said, I will translate it as kashful mahjub. Kashful mahjub is removing the veil. Of course, it's the name of Kalabaz's work on tasawwuf also, obviously. So it's a well-known term, in our tradition. But removing the veil before the object to be known is the key central act of what we call kashf here, unveiling, removing the veil. So that means that you have to take things seriously. That means you have to engage them. Now apply this to the social level, to other cultures and societies. You cannot treat them as devoid of meaning, significance, identity, memory, right? Other human beings, other cultures and societies who are completely alien to us, about whom we know very little. Of course, today we know about everything, just a little bit. So 100 years ago, if you were asked about the Chinese culture, or Aborigines in Australia, for example, or Native Americans in America, North America, for example, we wouldn't know much about them, right? What their languages are, what cultures they have, and what kind of food they eat, etc. We don't know anything about them. But according to this principle, you have to first assume that while they are as equal as you are, as human beings, they have their own culture, tradition, spheres of meaning, contexts of relationship, right? You cannot treat them as just brute animals, as the European colonialists did in the 19th century. I've written about this in my, well, I don't want to do a commercial here, but in my new upcoming book, inshallah, very soon, it's so distressing to see how they played with these ideas and concepts of modern anthropology and ethnography, where they created what they call the human zoos in the middle of Europe and in the United States. I don't know if you have ever seen human zoos. Zoo, when you say zoo, of course, you immediately think of animals being in a park, right? They established, starting, I think, in the second half of the 19th century, all the way until 1958, they established human zoos in major European capitals, in Brussels, in Berlin, in London, in Paris, and also in a couple of states and cities in the United States, where they brought the so-called primitive people from the Philippines, from Africa, from Latin America, from Australia, to display them to the pleasures of modern civilized, so-called civilized city dwellers of Europe. Of course, they never treated them as human beings. They were objects of curiosity. Oh, look at them. They eat. Wow, interestingly. They talk to one another. Yeah, I mean, they're backward. They're not developed enough. But look, they show signs of humanity. Interesting. You think that this is old story from the 19th century. As I said, the last human zoo in Europe was established, opened in 1958 in Brussels, at the heart of Europe. It's 1958. But I'll give you a more recent example. Just a couple of weeks ago, it just happened that I was trying to finish up the book and writing the final sentences and final touches, because the publisher keeps pressuring me like, okay, you have to send in the book. I read this news. Actually, it was on TV. It said the scientists discovered a primitive tribe in the Amazon with drones. They spotted 15 members of this primitive tribe, uncivilized, disconnected from the modern civilized world of science and technology. And these 15 members of this primitive tribe, I keep repeating because that's how the language was, the word primitive, cut off from the civilized world. They didn't say barbarians, but I'm sure 50 years ago they will have used the word barbarian, but they just said primitive, uncivilized people, and they were seen as walking. They had some instruments in their hands, and the scientists thought maybe they are weapons. The last sentence in the report said, last year, the gold miners in the Amazon area killed 10 members of this tribe. And I said, who is civilized, who is primitive here? These people living in the depth of the Amazon forests, who did not harm anyone, who did not pose any threat to anyone, who just lived by themselves, and probably they are just a few hundred left of them. And the modern man comes with his drones. Just look at the imagination. I mean, the image here is really unbelievable. With drones, you come and you look upon them from high, right? These are like, underdeveloped types of existence, human, animal type of thing. And you try to understand them by looking down upon them. Just look at the imagery there. And the last sentence of the news report is that 10 members of this tribe were killed by miners, gold miners, last year. And I'm like, well, the guys who are supposedly studying these people are the primitive, uncivilized barbarians here. And these people are the civilized, unharmful people. And we are killing them. And they're going to go extinct, I'm sure, in a couple of decades. But that's how we have adopted this way of thinking. Even today, as I said, this news report was just you can go on CNN and see it. The whole language and everything was on CNN. So in order to understand existence and have a serious thinking as an exercise in existence, in ontology, I have to take existence seriously. That means that serious thinking has to begin with a proper understanding of ontology, because there is no proper epistemology without a proper ontology, to use a more technical term of philosophy. Okay, I know we are running out of time. I don't want to turn this into a long lecture. Thinking is not only about existence, but thinking also entails the use of multiple faculties. It's not only my reason and my senses with which I have access to the world of things. I have to employ some other faculties as well. As the world of creation or the world of existence is a whole, integrated, interdependent, so the tools with which I try to understand this whole, this reality, must reflect the same complexity. It has to match what I'm trying to understand. So if I'm trying to understand a very complex, a multi-layered picture by just looking at it from a single point of view, with a single color in my eye, I will never understand that complexity. I will reduce it to a very simple, limited dimension of it, but it will never reflect that thing as a whole. So I have to have multiple faculties. That means that beyond reason and the senses, I have to employ heart. I have to employ artistic thinking. I have to employ emotions. I have to employ the conscious as also faculties of understanding, so that we avoid this kind of reductionism. And the heart, the mind, reason, intellect, the spirit, the soul, senses, emotions, these different types of faculties, in fact, were never seen as in clash with one another in the Islamic intellectual tradition. They were seen as complementing each other. Because the reality is such that I have to employ all of them to understand, of course, the relationship between cause and effect, make a scientific study of it, but also want to enjoy the birds chirping. I want to enjoy the sunrise. As a human being, that is also part of my duty in this world, to understand the world of existence, to enjoy its beauty. I cannot reduce that beauty to just some physical elements of color and smell. If I do, I lose that beauty. There is that material physical element to it, no doubt. I can study it in scientific terms as if I am a physicist or chemist. I can certainly do a physical or chemical analysis of smell and sight and color. But I know that that color, that smell is more than just those physical properties, as we discussed the question of the book and the chair. And in fact, they are presented to me for my enjoyment also, in addition to being beneficial to my life. So I have to employ these different faculties. In fact, the Quran is very clear about this. The Quran treats, not only, of course, addresses human reason, aql, our senses, ihsas or his, certainly they're out there, but also says, use your heart to understand things. In fact, there is that verse in the Quran, وَقُلُوبٌ لَهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا. They have hearts with which they do not reason or intellect. So the heart has an epistemic function also in the Islamic intellectual tradition, something that we have completely lost in the modern world. Because when you talk about the heart, that's all emotions, sentimentality, it's all psychology, no truth to it, no substance, no basis to it. No, that's not the case. And look at the world that we have created, a heartless world. With all the richness and material, economic, technological tools and advantages that we have today in this world, look at the world of suffering. Look at the world of the poor, the refugees, the underdogs, the underprivileged. Look at the gap between the rich and the poor. So it is making our life much more difficult. It is making our world much darker when you lose sight of these key elements that the Islamic intellectual tradition provides. So no conflict has been detected or seen between reason and heart, between logic and transcendence, between principles of or logical discursive thinking and emotions, between science and art. It was as a result of this perspective that the Islamic civilization produced multi-talented artists, scientists, scholars. None of our great luminaries from the classical period was just an expert in one single field. Ibn Rushd was a philosopher as well as a judge. Ibn Sina was a doctor, a cosmologist, a philosopher, also a very good writer. right? He wrote novels as well. Salamanu Absal, Hayy ibn Yaqzan, he wrote philosophical novels as well. Ghazali was a scholar of religious sciences, but also he was a mystic, he was a murshid, he was a great spiritual leader, he was a poet. Ibn al-Arabi, again, I mean, you know, he was so well versed in so many different fields of Islamic culture and sciences, Islamic religious sciences, that is ulum naqliya as well as ulum aqliya, intellectual sciences. And I can give many, many examples from Al-Buruni to Suhrawardi, Mullah Sadra, and many others. What made this possible to have this kind of multi-talented, multidisciplined scholarship was not the genius of these particular scholars, but it was the intellectual environment and the climate in which they flourished. It, in fact, gave them the opportunity, but also forced them to be like that. And of course, we are lacking it today. So we are trying to hang on to one particular field just a little bit. If you have some depth in any particular field, we feel lucky that, oh, at least we know this much. But that's not enough. That gives us a very fragmented, disordered picture of reality. If you are to understand the world as a whole, again, our epistemic faculties and tools must match the reality of that which we are trying to understand. My final comments. Talked about information. We said information is not knowledge. Knowledge is something different, and thinking is not just data analysis or information processing. It's more than that. So we have at least, I think, a sense of where our thinking should be, right? But that is in itself not sufficient. We have to go even beyond that and search for wisdom. All this will make sense. Information, knowledge, data, statistics. They will all make sense only if we turn them into tools with which we try to reach and attain wisdom. What is wisdom? Hikmah. Again, our intellectual tradition has defined wisdom as that for which things are. That is, it gives the reason for which something is. It explains why something is the way it is. Hikmah, for which we do the things that we do. Why does the world exist? Again, we can have a long discussion about this, right? By calling sources from philosophy, theology, tasawwuf, and other fields. But the answer to that question is the hikmah for this world. You can say, well, God wanted to create the world, so that's the hikmah. That's the reason why the world exists. You can say, well, God could not have created, otherwise God will have been a stingy being. That's another explanation. You could have said, well, the world exists eternally. Well, that's another explanation. But that's the reason for which the world exists. But I think the key thing is that for every questioning in your mind, you have to go beyond just collecting information and knowledge about that subject. Try to reach into that depth of wisdom. Because hikmah is related to hukum, judgment. And the problem today we have, in the Muslim world especially, is that we have too much judgment, hukum, and very little hikmah. When we teach religion, even to our children, to ourselves, we give them the hukum, ahkam, do this, do that, this is haram, this is halal, this is this is that. Okay, that's fine. We state the hukum without explaining the hikmah. Why I should avoid X, Y, Z, and why I should do X, Y, Z. The Quranic method is that the Quran spent like 10 years in Mecca alone, explaining the hikmah before bringing down one single hukum. For 10 years, the Quran, God himself, spent 10 years explaining the hikmah for which he created the world, with which he was preparing the Muslim community. Through Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, he explained to the first community why they should believe in one God, why they should uphold the principle of justice, why they should reject racism and discrimination and tribalism, why they should stop gambling or drinking, why they should, and go down the list. This was the hikmah. And hikmah, wisdom, always comes before hukum. So even if you're studying fiqh, where you deal with ahkam and, etc., you have to have the dimension of hikmah to explain why certain juridical principles have been established in the first place. And I think today, if we are to think about our own future, our own present, we have to start thinking about the ways with which or through which we can reach hikmah for ourselves, for the Muslim ummah, and for the world. Thank you.